What is going on, Headliner Nation? Week 14, 6 teams on a bye, but the good news is we're not missing a plethora of wide receivers this week. There are a few top tier guys that we won't have access to, but for the most part, still a whole lot of depth this week. But if you're one of those teams that may be missing the top option, well, we've got you covered here. And there might be a few guys that you can put into your lineup this week that still could help you reach your upside and walk away with a fantasy football victory the week before your playoffs begin. And maybe Thursday Night Football will have a ton of action from the wide receiver position. We've got some really good options here, and Jayden Reed and Amon-Ra St. Brown will be the two guys we're paying the closest attention to. Jayden Reed didn't have a huge volume day last week, but he still had 6 targets, and a lot of those looks came in the red zone with 2 touchdowns. So Jayden Reed still has that ability to score. The rest of the wide receivers right now are really up and down, and some of it's going to depend on Romeo Doubs, who, as of this recording, was still limited in practice with concussion issues. Tucker Kraft feels like he's kind of the number 2 target right now, and then you have some up and down performances from Dontavian Wicks and Christian Watson. Now, Christian Watson is a high-risk guy, but we know this Detroit secondary can give up some bigger plays, and if he were to find some space out in the open, he definitely can have a couple of big plays, including a potential big touchdown. We saw it against Detroit last year. And we know Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to have plenty of targets in this game. Scoring a touchdown absolutely will allow him to reach his ceiling. And Detroit should be able to move the ball on this Green Bay defense, and Green Bay is going to be able to move the ball on the Detroit defense. Thursday Night Football could definitely be a great start to the football week, and Amon-Ra St. Brown could have a great performance for your fantasy team. His floor is going to be there every single game. And Jameson Williams could go one or two ways. Yeah, he might only get 4 targets in a game, and those 4 targets could only go for 35 yards, and he's not going to be worth a start in your fantasy lineup. But those 4 targets could end up going for 120 yards and a touchdown, and he becomes one of the best fantasy scorers of the week for your team. It really just depends. Do you need to risk the upside, or do you want to play it a little bit more safe with somebody else? The Tennessee Titans are allowing the 4th fewest receiving yards and 8th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. So Brian Thomas Jr., while we may need a big week from him this week, he may not be able to give it to us. He's definitely lost a lot of that top 12 potential that we saw earlier in the season. He was wide receiver 13 last week with 10 targets and a touchdown, so the opportunity absolutely will be there. But in a matchup like this against a secondary that's been strong all season long, that upside is going to be dependent on maybe 1 or 2 big plays. If he finds that big play, that's great. That's going to help his fantasy day get into that really safe wide receiver 2 position. And if he has a couple of big plays, maybe he starts to work his way up to that wide receiver 13 finish we saw last week. But more than likely with Brian Thomas Jr. and then Mac Jones under center, we're trying to really find that wide receiver 24 to 18 area and get those type of points from him. Calvin Ridley and the very surprising Nick Westbrook-Ikhine are 2 guys that could be fantasy assets this week. Calvin Ridley has way more upside than NWI, but NWI has all of that touchdown potential. And last week we saw some volume come with that touchdown, which is the one thing that's really made him a risky start for the last few weeks. We know he's been scoring, but there hasn't been a ton of volume with him, so he's been very lucky. But if we start getting that type of volume, he could be a top 24 wide receiver the rest of the season. But a big issue is the fact that these guys combined for 15 targets last week and only caught 5 of them. The targets have not been very good. They're there, the volume is great, but the catchable targets are not right now. And that's what still makes NWI a little bit more on the risky side, because even if the targets are starting to come, they need to be better targets. Now, Calvin Ridley, I do think, has the best floor and highest ceiling of the 2 this week. Over on Underdog right now, his current receiving projection is only 60.5 receiving yards. That feels super safe to me. If you're putting him in any of your Underdog fantasy lineups, I'm absolutely going higher than 60.5 receiving yards. He could have a really, really big day, and 60.5 feels like the floor to me with a really nice ceiling to go along with it. We could potentially call this the matchup of the letdown wide receivers this season, because really Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle have been anything short of just frustrating to have on our fantasy teams. And it's not all their fault. Like, Aaron Rodgers coming back from his injury, we had to suspect that there was going to be some up and downs, but he's played really, really bad at times this season. Obviously for Miami, they lost Tua for a stretch of games once again, and their offense just really hasn't felt as explosive as it once was. So for all these guys trying to consistently play him, it is frustrating. Now, Miami's defense is currently allowing the third fewest fantasy points per game, along with the second fewest touchdowns and receiving yards to wide receivers. So this matchup for Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson is not going to be all that great. And again, with the way Aaron Rodgers has been playing, it's really tough to jump on either of these guys and expect them to be a safe play. The good news for these guys, 22 combined targets last week. For whatever reason, the New York Jets have decided that they're just going to throw. Screw Breece Hall, screw running the football and trying to establish the run and letting the pass work off that. Right now, they're kind of ass backwards because they're expecting the run game to go off the pass, but the pass hasn't been all that good. It was great to see Tyreek Hill return to being a wide receiver 1 last week. It was the first time since week 1 he had put together wide receiver 1 numbers. Now, the upside that we've come to expect from Tyreek Hill has not been there this season, but in 3 of his last 4 games, he has had at least wide receiver 2 performances. So there has been some floor with him when Tua came back. But if you're playing him as your wide receiver 1 and you drafted him at the top of the first round, you're expecting some better numbers. Jalen Waddle had his first top 12 performance a couple of weeks ago, finishing as the wide receiver 3, but then last week dropped all the way back down to wide receiver 36. And a lot of that has to do with Jonnu Smith. Right now, Jonnu Smith feels like a way more comfortable number 2 target for Tua than Jalen Waddle does. And that's not great for Waddle's value. He's going to continue to be like that over the last few weeks of the season. He might put together another top 12 performance at some point in time, but a majority of the time, his floor could have him more as a wide receiver 3, and maybe that's just what we need to anticipate. Drake London versus Justin Jefferson could be one of the money wide receiver matchups that we see this week, and I really like both of them to have really solid fantasy days. Drake London had 16 targets last week, and now he's getting a Minnesota defense that allows the 3rd most receiving yards and 2nd most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. He definitely could end up being in for a very solid day. Now, I don't feel as great about Darnell Mooney. He had 6 targets last week, but so did Ray McCloud. So while Darnell Mooney is going to be a medium risk for me, I definitely can't say he's nearly as safe as he once was this year. But right now, over on Underdog, Drake London has a projection of 68.5 receiving yards. Even if he doesn't get 16 targets and it drops back to 10 or maybe 12, he still has more than enough opportunity against this defense to put up a solid fantasy day and look at more like 80 receiving yards. I definitely like going higher than that projection. On the other sideline, Atlanta's defense doesn't give up a ton of receiving yards, but they do, however, allow wide receivers to score. They have given up the 3rd most receiving touchdowns on the season to wide receivers and the 7th most fantasy points per game. So Justin Jefferson absolutely has an opportunity to score this week. And Jordan Addison, who's been a wide receiver 2 in 3 of his last 5 games, has an opportunity to also find that type of upside once again. Over on Underdog, I'm going to put Justin Jefferson in for an anytime touchdown this week. I really like his potential to find the end zone in a game that could be really back and forth. Now, if Kirk Cousins continues to turn the ball over the way he has, it could get one-sided for Minnesota really quick. But if Kirk Cousins against his former team can play well, then at that point at least we'll find ourselves in a position where a back and forth game and a lot of fantasy points could happen. Out of absolutely nowhere, Marquez Valdes-Scantling has become a wide receiver 2 type of player here down the stretch. Over his last 3 games, he has 4 touchdowns. He's been a wide receiver 1 and a wide receiver 2 in 2 of those 3 games. And really for MVS, it's all about that big touchdown. Last week he did score, but he didn't have that big touchdown, so he only made it up to wide receiver 32. However, in this type of a matchup, if he can find that big touchdown once again, getting inside the top 24 is going to be pretty easy for him to do. Derek Carr's been looking his way quite a bit. The Saints are currently allowing the 5th most receiving yards and 6th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. And when you've got a guy like Malik Nabers, no matter who the quarterback is, you look at him as a high upside play just based on the volume alone. This is a guy that hasn't seen less than 8 targets in a game since week 1. And in week 1, he saw 7 targets, which has been his season low. He's really a lock for double-digit targets almost every single week. Over his last 5 games, he has at least 10 targets in 4 of those. And the 5th game, he had 9 targets. So I'm absolutely going to be throwing him out there as a safe play right now, especially in a matchup like this, because the volume will keep his floor really nice, and then he's got touchdown and upside potential to go along with it against a defense like this. Now, Wan'Dale Robinson could see 5, 6, 7, 8 double-digit targets, and he may only get you 40 receiving yards. Really, Wan'Dale Robinson is one of those flex plays right now that you throw in your lineup to kind of fill in for everybody else, because you know he's going to get you some points, even though he may not get you a ton. Listen, I get that Carolina is fighting right now, and I absolutely love to see it, especially from Bryce Young. This guy felt like he was completely written off this season, and to see him playing much better and showing some of that potential here over the last few games, I absolutely love it, because I'm still on board with the guy being a good NFL quarterback. But there is a big difference between facing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense and the defense of the Philadelphia Eagles. Right now, Carolina is going to be running into a buzzsaw of one of the best, if not the best team in the NFL right now. And even as a Lions fan, I can definitely tell you this Eagles team worries me, especially on the defensive side of the ball, with how well they play against the run and the pass. So for this week, I don't think I could find any reason to start any of these Carolina wide receivers. Philly is allowing the fewest receiving yards to wide receivers right now. This matchup, the reward does not outweigh the risk. I really hate putting A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith at medium risk plays this week, but quite honestly, even though they're both starters for me, their ceiling may not be obtainable. What if Philadelphia is leading this game by 2 or 3 scores in the second half, and they're just running the football? These guys may not get a ton of targets just based off that alone. Now, Devontae Smith has also been banged up, so what if they decide to take him out of the game early or limit him knowing that this is one that they should win? Those different things could happen in this game. A.J. Brown could have a great first half, and you could feel like you're on to a huge fantasy day, and then he only gets 10 fantasy points because not a lot happens in the second half. Devontae Smith could end up being limited and on and off the field, and while that big play touchdown absolutely could happen against this defense, if it doesn't, then he doesn't have that great of a day. So really, that's why there's risk associated with both of these guys. Floors should be okay. Ceilings is where the issue is. 27 targets, 17 receptions, 346 total receiving yards. Those are the gaudy numbers that Elijah Moore and Jerry Jeudy combined for against the Denver Broncos on Monday Night Football. We'll keep an eye on Cedric Tillman moving forward as well, because he could be back from the concussion protocol soon. And in a matchup like this, going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, it is another tough pass defense, just like Denver was. But when you get the insane amount of throwing volume from Jameis Winston, anything can happen. And while a couple of these guys are definitely going to be risky, we could find fantasy value in all 3 of them. When you talk about guys who have leveled up their game throughout the season, you have to include George Pickens. He went from being the wide receiver 24 from weeks 1 through 6 to now up to wide receiver 14 from week 7 and on. He has definitely found a ceiling at this half of the season that he did not have earlier in the year with Justin Fields. So some bigger plays are absolutely showing up and more touchdowns as well. He still has some more ceiling to be found, however, and in this matchup, which is so favorable for him, he absolutely could be well within inside the top 12 wide receivers this week. And if he has a big performance this week, it definitely could put him inside the top 12 wide receivers now since week 7. But when you talk about people that can help you level up your game, it makes perfect sense that the fantasy headliners in Turtle Beach would be partnering again this holiday season. Because whether it's one of their world-class headsets, a mouse and keyboard, or a controller, having Turtle Beach equipment can take you from being an absolute noob to one of the sweatiest players in your friend group. And when that text message goes out, assembling the boys to hop on and start running through some lobbies together, you're going to be one of the first ones they call, because you're going to be carrying everybody in your backpack. Seriously, start setting up some chiropractor appointments now, because with Turtle Beach, your back's going to be hurting you from carrying everybody you know. And the guys that I game with are always making fun of me because I have back issues, but joke's on them. I have back issues because they need carried to all of the victories that we have, and Turtle Beach is a big reason why. So whether you want to level up your game or help somebody else level up theirs, head on over to turtlebeach.com/headliners and you can get 10% off your entire order at checkout by using code word headliners. Make sure this holiday season you give the gift of absolute gaming dominance over at Turtle Beach. Jakobi Meyers truthers are relentless, and over the last few weeks we've heard a lot of people in the comments asking, how can you not show more love to our boy Jakobi Meyers? It's pretty simple. He's only been a wide receiver one twice this season, and over the last 3 weeks he only has one top 24 performance. He was the wide receiver 26 last week, even with decent numbers in half PPR leagues. So when you look at Jakobi Meyers, you see a decent floor with not a whole lot of room to chase upside. And that's probably one of the reasons why we haven't been on him a whole lot more than what Jakobi truthers would like us to be doing. However, I'm going to unite with the Jakobi Meyers truthers this week and make him my Manscaped must-start matchup of the week. Going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he should absolutely have a super solid floor this week with plenty of room for upside. Now, he's going to need to score to reach that upside, but a top 24 floor is exactly what we get from him in a matchup that gives him so much potential. And then if he finds that touchdown, then maybe we get closer to having those wide receiver one type numbers that a lot of you would love to see more often from him. And if you want to make sure that you can be consistently labeled as a must start, then you need to head on over to manscaped.com and check out all of their amazing tools that will help you be at your best self. And right now, use code word headliners20 for 20% off your entire order and free shipping over at manscaped.com. Now, Mike Evans is a little bit of a mid-risk for me this week because Las Vegas does a pretty decent job of limiting big plays. So a lot of those plays that Mike Evans would use to really prop up his fantasy value may not end up being there this week. And of course, running the football with Bucky Irving will be a huge part of the game plan as well. Mike Evans, though, is chasing another 1,000-yard season to continue extending his streak of 1,000-yard seasons to begin a career. And he's going to have some really good games down the stretch to be able to do that. So it would not shock me if Baker Mayfield is forcing the ball his way a little bit more often, but this is also a really solid matchup for Cade Otton as well. I think it's time that we officially label Jackson Smith-Njigba as the wide receiver one in Seattle. Over his last 5 weeks, he has at least 69 receiving yards in every single game. And the other wide receiver that was kind of the de facto wide receiver one, DK Metcalf, hasn't even been a top 24 wide receiver one time since week 3. JSN is a safe start for me every single week now moving forward. He's the guy that's getting the looks. DK Metcalf is much more risky at this point, and if you're trying to start him, you're looking at a floor of wide receiver 3 and probably a ceiling of not much higher than that. Tyler Lockett shouldn't even be started right now. I've been trying my best to stay optimistic with Marvin Harrison Jr., but the roller coaster of his fantasy season is just a little bit too much at this point. He'll be a wide receiver 1 week, not even startable the next. Wide receiver 2, not even startable. Wide receiver 2, not even startable. Wide receiver 1, not... You get the picture. I don't need to go any further. It's just so much up and down with him that he'll give us a fantasy viable week and then completely disappear the week after that. This matchup is not one of the best, and Devin Witherspoon will be covering him this week, so his path to fantasy upside is going to be tough. At this point, Khalil Shakir is probably a little bit closer to being Wan'Dale Robinson than he is one of the top wide receivers in this league. But he's put together solid floor numbers all season long, and he's clearly being targeted plenty at this point, that by putting him in your lineup, you're not really worried about him. You know you're going to get a decent floor every single week, and if you're trying to start him as like your wide receiver 1 or 2, that's an issue. But wide receiver 3 or a flex play, it really isn't all that bad of an idea to continue to run him out there. Since week 7, he's had at least 7 targets in every single game. So he's got Josh Allen's eye, and when you have that, you should be solid with plenty of volume. Now, statistically speaking, this matchup sucks for the LA Rams, but when you have Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua on the field together, you got to know that they're going to see plenty of targets. Both of these guys can see 10 plus targets every single week, and Stafford is looking for each of these guys every single week. Now, the ceiling may not be great, especially if Matthew Stafford's getting knocked around a little bit or he throws any picks. But Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, if we can lock him in for double-digit targets, then we have to be starting them every single week, even if they are a little bit risky because of the upside or the fact that we look at them as being a low risk because they're going to get the volume, and we just know that the upside may not be there. I think it's really difficult to expect or anticipate what we may get from the Chicago Bears wide receivers this week. San Francisco has done a good job of limiting wide receivers all season. They're currently allowing the 6th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers. However, over the last couple of weeks, Keenan Allen for sure and DJ Moore have both picked it up. They've been wide receiver 1 players each of the last 2 weeks, while Rome Odunze kind of been the odd man out. However, he does have 32 targets over his last 4 games. So the looks are still there, but the production really hasn't been there. So you take a look at this tough matchup going up against San Francisco. May have to throw it a little bit. It really depends on how good San Francisco's offense ends up being this week. And then you've got 3 wide receivers who are all seeing decent volume, but really only 2 of them at a time are producing. When you have a situation like that, it's just really tough to nail down expectations. There's a good chance that we're at the point where Deebo Samuel should be regulated to the bench. Over the last 6 weeks, he has 1 fantasy viable performance. 1 top 36 wide receiver performance is what I mean by that. So 1 time over the last 6 weeks have you put him in your lineup and he actually produced enough to warrant being in your lineup. Juwan Jennings has 34 targets over the last 4 games. If anything, he's the much safer target in this offense right now. It goes George Kittle, then Juwan Jennings. They're going to run the football, and then Deebo Samuel. When people talk about Ladd McConkey's performance this season, I don't think it's the performance itself that's shocked anybody. Coming out of college, he had some great tools that would help him translate well to the NFL level. The biggest issue is that Ladd McConkey never stayed healthy in college. Even back to his high school days, he had one of, if not the worst injury profile in the 2024 draft class. So it was all about staying healthy, and so far this season, he's been able to do exactly that. So the numbers that he's putting up really aren't that surprising. It's the fact that he's been on the field the entire time. There's only been 2 games this year where he's had less than 6 targets, and in 3 of his last 5 games, he has at least 100 receiving yards. This matchup, not one of the best. Kansas City doesn't allow a ton of yards. You can score on them through the air, but Ladd McConkey has a little bit of a lower ceiling this week, but because of the target share and the fact that you're probably going to have to throw it against Kansas City on the road, he should still be a very solid play. From a pure football perspective, DeAndre Hopkins has been pretty solid since being traded to the Chiefs. He's been able to allow that offense to operate as normal, and even though it still struggles at times, it could be a whole lot worse. From a fantasy football perspective, however, DeAndre Hopkins isn't nearly as exciting as I would like him to be. Since he was traded to Kansas City Chiefs, 1 wide receiver 1 performance and 1 wide receiver 2 performance. Outside of that, he really hasn't been startable, and this matchup is going to be tougher for him, so I don't know if I expect a really high ceiling. The Cincinnati Bengals have one of the best offenses in all of football. I mean, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Chase Brown has been playing like an all-pro over the last few weeks. This team puts up really gaudy numbers. But part of that is also because their defense sucks. From a football standpoint, this is awful for their record, but from a fantasy standpoint, we take advantage of this, because if the Dallas Cowboys are able to score some points on the Cincinnati Bengals, that's great. Cincinnati is going to continue to throw it, and Joe Burrow's been throwing it an awful lot lately, which is great for Jamar Chase and great for T. Higgins. It gives them both a really solid floor, but it gives them a good ceiling as well. And over on Underdog, Jamar Chase's projection sits at 77.5 receiving yards right now. And as long as Dallas stays in this game or at least keeps it competitive, he should see plenty of targets, and I'm going to go higher than that projection currently. And if Cincinnati's defense doesn't show up to play this week, CeeDee Lamb should have a super safe floor. Hasn't had a huge ceiling since Cooper Rush took over, but he's still been fantasy viable. It could be way worse for CeeDee Lamb. He could be in a position like Tyreek Hill, where Tyreek Hill, we were trying to figure out if we should even consider playing. CeeDee Lamb should be in your lineup. Even if he's giving you wide receiver 2 numbers, that's better than nothing. And also, Brandon Cooks has a little bit of big play potential for me this week. I don't want to put him as a high risk, and he's definitely not a low risk, but he's kind of right in the middle right now because against this defense, a big play here or there could make his entire fantasy day. Well, there you have it, Headliner Nation. My analysis and breakdown for every matchup in Week 14 for the wide receiver position. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and turn on the bell notifications. Anytime we drop new content or go live, you'll be notified. You can hop right in here, start consuming the content right away. But for now, Headliner Nation, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.